Buenas and half a day from Guam. You're listening to Memoirs Pasifika, a podcast exploring events, movements, and people in modern Micronesian history. I'm Tony Azios, the show's producer. This is the final episode of Season 1, so we decided to make it a bit different than the others by highlighting portions of interviews from past episodes that didn't make the final cut, but that we still want to share with you. I'll serve as this episode's anchor, but you'll still hear questions being asked by several of our previous anchors who conducted most of those interviews. Sometimes these clips provide more context or a cool anecdote for a topic we delved into in a prior episode. Or in other cases, they offer greater insight into the personal development of the interviewee or their emotional state at the time of the events in question. And sometimes they speak at length about a different historical event or topic altogether than what the interview was officially about. But it still covers something we think our audience, you, might find interesting. So this episode will probably make a lot more sense to audience members who have already listened to our first 6 shows. But if you haven't, no worries, you can still begin with this one. Hopefully it will make you want to scroll back and listen to the full episodes these interviews are sourced from. Okay, let's begin. This first interview we're revisiting was conducted for episode 1, which tells the story of Guam Governor Carlos Camacho's trip to Vietnam at the height of the war to visit his island's battle-weary troops. We spoke with Mary Camacho Torres, who is the daughter of the late Governor Carlos Camacho and currently serves as a senator in the 36th Guam legislature. She provided us with several candid, funny, and even heartbreaking memories relating to her father's trip to Vietnam, which were used in the episode. But the following excerpt didn't make it in because it was peripheral to the main storyline. However, she speaks here about a number of things that will interest students of Guam's political history. The best part is, she's able to relay her interpretation of these events from the perspective of a child who grew up watching the island's leaders craft its future course and reshape Guam's political and economic landscapes. We also get a better sense of who Carlos Camacho was as a politician and as a father. Let's listen as Senator Mary Torres speaks with Dr. Michael Lujan Bavacqua, the curator of the Guam Museum and anchor for episode 1.
And so, did he like to joke around a lot? Was he a funny guy, or was he more serious?
Oh, he was a funny guy. He was so soft-spoken, I think a lot like me, quiet and unassuming. But he had a way of always mingling, and he made friends with all kinds of people. He was the type of person that never saw rank, that just loved people for who they were. I mean, he just absolutely enjoyed life. And I just remember people liking him then and to this day, telling me how much they loved him. I mean, strangers approach me all the time and say, I absolutely love your dad. Your dad was my friend. They always say that. He was my friend.
And so when your dad got into politics, I know that the Territorial Party was one of the 2 major parties, but then he was also part of the change to the Republican Party. And so I wonder if you can talk about that.
I remember that vividly, even though I was very young. I was probably only 6 years old when the Territorial Party was meeting in the garage of our home in Okatamuning. And then they would sometimes be inside in the living room. But I remember that era because it was a time where the Popular Party had formed or merged into the Democratic National Party. So there was a sense that they needed to bring the Territorial Party into another level and associate themselves with a national party, which at that time would have been the Republican Party. So he was instrumental in that. And I remember as a little girl, because I was one of those kids that was always interested in, first of all, I was my father's pet, being the only daughter. So I was always riding on his coattails and, checking out whatever was going on. But I would be poking around and they would be having their meetings and he'd make myself useful. So he'd say, go, Marion, go make us some drinks or something. Go make lemonade. And so he'd tell everyone, oh, she's great at making lemonade. And so I was part of the mix in that sense, right? But they did eventually form the Republican Party of Guam. And he was the first president when they did the Articles of Association. And he was also the lead in carrying the petition to the Republican National Convention so that Guam would be recognized as part of the National Republican Party. So he was very instrumental at that point early in our lives. And it made an impression on the kids because we kind of saw things evolving.
You had mentioned earlier that you recall them meeting in the garage. Can you take us back to that?
In those early days, a lot of the business was done in the back kitchen, in the garage, in those very informal settings where people could just gather and hash things out. And that's what I remember. They would set up a table in the garage of our home, which is a carport just right outside the kitchen. And sometimes they would gravitate into the house, into the dining room, when I suppose it got a little hot or when it was time for snacks and drinks and things like that. So a lot of it was done there. It was just a bunch of people. There were maybe only 6 of them that would gather regularly to discuss how to go forward with coming into the national charter of the Republican Party.
Going back to those early days, do you remember your dad campaigning? He ran for senator, and then he was appointed, and then he ran for governor as well. But what was it like sort of being young in those days and seeing your father campaign and connect with people?
Campaigning in those days was very, very hands-on, and it involved going into the communities and having large rallies. You have to remember, in those days, technology wasn't so advanced. And there wasn't all that much money to circulating. So everything had to be door-to-door canvassing, rallies that they assembled, pocket meetings. And that was the nature of it in those days. So it was like a great party all the time. And families were always involved because where there was gatherings, there was always refreshments and things like that. So it involved other family members to make it successful.
So Carlos Camacho has the distinction of being the last appointed and the first elected governor for Guam. So what was it like for him to get this honor, like last appointed, first elected?
It was a pivotal time for Guam, and that was the significance of getting the Elective Governor Act approved, because you have to recall that Guam's history was a history of Spanish occupation. Then there was a history of naval governance, and then presidential appointments through the Office of Insular Affairs. So the ability and the right to choose your own leaders through popular election was the first step towards greater self-governance. My father saw that, because you have to recall, he was coming out of World War II into a new era where it was a reset for Guam, right? Modernization was coming. So it was a time where we had to think about our economic stability. You had to think about how to then gain control of critical infrastructure, which at the time was owned by the Navy. Everything was owned by the Navy at the time. Our water system, our power generation system, our telecommunication system, it was all controlled by the Navy. So to be able to choose your own governor, have your own governor set the agenda for the island, for what the island would be generations down the road, was critical. At the time, too, when he was able to win that first election, his very first task was to bring back the Chamorros to Guam. All the Chamorros like him who had been educated in the U.S., who had skill sets, he was so dead set on reversing that brain drain, of bringing the island back so that the people can kind of start on a path of being more self-reliant and being in control of their destinies. He brought them to Guam and made them part of his cabinet. And these weren't people that were politically aligned with him. These were just people who were local people who had a vested interest in seeing Guam succeed and who had the competency, and he helped, foster their will to come back and serve the island. So that was what he was about, his empowerment of the Chamorros, of having people understand that you not only can make decisions for yourself, but you can also carry out and be in charge of your destiny. And so a lot of what we see in Guam, the fact that we are where we are right now, well-educated, competent, able to govern ourselves, make choices for ourselves, and decide what we want for Guam and her people. A lot of that was born by Governor Camacho. We just celebrated the Elective Governors Act 50 years, last year. And what was interesting was many of the cabinet members that came for that resolution ceremony at the legislature were people some of whom are still leaders in our community. Governor Gutierrez was part of that administration. Jerry Perez at GVB is part of that administration. Mr. St. Augustine was part of that administration. Catherine Uggan is part of that administration. So you see there was a whole plethora of people from different walks of life, different political agendas. But the one common thread was, we are from Guam. We want to help our Chamorro people. We want to be in control of our destiny. And so that to me was Governor Camacho. And he did it. He did it in a way that he brought people together because they liked him. They believed in him. They wanted to work with him. And they want to work together. And I wish we could go back to those days. Not this divisiveness or this judgment or this, but just that sense of are we in this or are we not? Are we going to work together or are we not? Where do we want Guam to go? And how are we going to respectively put in to get to that goal? And I'm proud of that. I'm proud that, I'm proud when people say that I'm Carlos's daughter. Even though he wasn't there to mentor me when I was my brother Felix, who became governor, a lot of the example that he showed in his administration permeated and really was a guiding light for Felix and I, and my brothers as well, who serve in different capacities in the community. So he was the kind of guy that raised his kids to say, nope, you're competent. He never spoiled us, believe it or not. We weren't spoiled. But we had a sense of duty, right? Just humility, just duty. So that's where, even though he died when I was 18 years old, he died when Felix was 21. How would an 18-year-old manage to hang on to that all those years if that example wasn't so ingrained in you? In a good way, right? In a good way. Because he wasn't there to slap us if we did wrong. He wasn't there to lure us in, or give us favor. To make us, we had none of that. That's really his legacy as a father and as a leader. And he really was a leader, but not the leader that we think of now, the powerful. He was just the kind of guy that you followed because he made you feel good. He really did. He made you feel good. He made you trust in yourself, and he made you believe in a program, in a plan. And a lot of people bought into that.
Next, we'll play part of an interview with Dr. Laura Marie Torres Sauter, a longtime Chamorro activist, scholar, and educator. This clip is much shorter than what we just heard, but somewhat similar in the sense that we get to hear from someone who has done so much to shape Guam's current culture and politics as she reflects on critical moments from her childhood when she was observing and quietly learning from a political and cultural powerhouse of the time. We interviewed Dr. Sauter for episode 2, which is about how Cecilia Cruz Bamba successfully took on the U.S. federal government on behalf of Guam's World War II survivors and their descendants by championing the causes of compensation for land claims and war reparations. These acts alone are incredibly impressive, but as an accomplished businesswoman, a Guam senator, a board member for dozens of civic organizations, and the mother of 10 children, Mrs. Bamba wore many important hats. In episode 2, Dr. Sauter describes how as a young woman fresh out of college, Cecilia Bamba was her mentor. In this new clip, however, we go back further to hear how even as a very young girl, Sauter was already learning about civic engagement from Mrs. Bamba.
We really had a very multifaceted relationship as well. Usually, when we meet someone as a mentor or a friend, it's in that context that we have a relationship with them. But for me, Mrs. Bamba was Mom's very close friend. They co-founded the Guam Memorial Hospital Volunteers Association together and were charter members of the Guam Women's Club. They were both very active in FAWA, the Federation of Asian Women's Association, and the Guam Beauty Association, which sponsored the Guam Universe pageants. So a lot of their public engagement, community engagement, drove what we as their children were engaged in, because we were always being volunteered along with them to do activities. And Mrs. Bamba's daughters, particularly Rosemary, who was at the academy when I was, Rose was 1 year ahead of me. We were, I wouldn't say co-opted, but we were taken into their orbit of activities, and we engaged voluntarily in a lot of the activities that they engaged in at the levels where children of these organizers were involved, and learned a lot from them in terms of how to organize. I remember being introduced to Robert's Rules of Order because I would go along with Mom, and Mrs. Bamba would be there too. Rosemary would be there. She would bring her daughters with her, and we learned different ways of participating in organizational work by being their helpers. So that was the first introduction I had to Mrs. Bamba. And then, of course, later she became my mentor.
Our third episode discusses Guam's role as the primary way station for 112,000 South Vietnamese refugees in the chaotic months immediately following the end of the Vietnam War. It features interviews with several folks from Guam who played a part in the evacuation and resettlement efforts, and even with the anchor's own grandmother, who briefly came through the island as a refugee. We also heard from a married couple named Gordon and Vicki Ritter, who met while working with the Red Cross during Operation New Life. Their interview yielded several gripping stories that were used in the episode, but they also shared some fascinating details we didn't use about what their jobs were like on the day-to-day. Here are the Ritters speaking with Dr. Evan Lay Espiritu Gandhi, an assistant professor of Asian American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Oh, and please bear with us on the variable sound quality of this interview. We recorded it outdoors due to COVID-19, so there's wind noise. I was sitting a bit far from the microphones, and our anchor called in via Zoom from California.
And you explained this a little bit, but maybe you can expand. What role did you play during Operation New Life? Did you volunteer for the Red Cross, and what were your responsibilities?
Okay, I was a locator. That was my job title at Operation New Life. And my job was to locate missing families or family members. And the way we located them was looking through all those printouts of people that had come out, and they were at different areas. But our job was to find those names, and the names came from the caseworkers for the Red Cross.
I volunteered for that month on the phones, and then I asked Alan Geyer, who's the head of Western Area Red Cross, how could I get a job, because I didn't have a job at the time. And he says, well, you have to quit. And I said, okay, I quit. And he hired me as a caseworker, which meant we would get information on a person and then check if we can find them on Guam. I used to call Subic Bay and in the Philippines, Air Force Base there, and they had refugees there, and they also had a number of other places I'd call. But going out and finding bodies on Guam, or people, their actual body, was really hard because people tended to move. But that was my job, is to get the information, are they there, and try to find the actual people.
Anybody that was listed anywhere, they would have their names on that list. So we might be able to find them and say, okay, the last location was in Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, and then they can go from there.
As a caseworker, technically, I guess I was sort of her boss, because she would get information we wanted or bring information to us that they found, and we would carry that on further. Our job was to actually go try to find the person physically, or call people up and let them know we found them and where we think they are.
So tell me a little bit more about the difficulties of locating Vietnamese refugees. I know, for example, all of us have similar last names. There's a lot of last names, Wing or Win. And then also, I think I remember reading there was some confusion about whether the last name goes first or last, because there's a different convention in Vietnamese versus English. So I'm wondering if any of that played a role in your ability to locate the Vietnamese refugees.
Yeah, one of the biggest problems was the guys taking the information down and writing it when they first came in. If it was written down, a lot of Vietnamese have very flowery writing, and that's hard to read sometimes. And then there was also a language barrier. And when they wrote it down, lots of times they didn't know how to spell it, and they spelled it the best way they could. So you'd have Nguyen spelled with a beginning letter M, T's, all sorts of things. We didn't realize this for at least a month or two into it. And then we started looking all the other possibilities. And you're right, they sometimes put the first name last name first. And none of us were that familiar with Vietnamese names.
Yeah, and my one concern was we were told that some people might even make up fictitious names if they wanted to disappear, or they were afraid to be found, or something like that. So there was no documentation or any kind of proof of the way you spell your name or anything. So the people would just write it down, like Gordon said, any way that they thought it would be spelled. So when I looked up a name, I would look it up in all different orders, all different possibilities of what it might be, the person. But it was tricky, really, finding names. And sometimes we'd find it, and sometimes we just couldn't even find any leads.
Hey, I'm jumping back in for just a minute to give some needed context for the next part of this interview. If you've listened to episode 3, you know that there were multiple refugee camps throughout Guam, which were often referred to as tent cities. Most were tucked away out of civilian view on military bases, while others, such as Camp Assen, were visible from major civilian roads like Marine Corps Drive. And Gordon will briefly mention barracks being burnt down and a ship that, quote, went back. He's referring to the actions of a small group of refugees called the Repatriates, who demanded to be sent back to Vietnam. That aspect of Operation New Life is also discussed in depth in episode 3, so give it a listen if you'd like to learn more. Okay, back to the interview as I ask the Ritters about Camp Assen, and they share a bit about what life was like there.
Tell me a little bit about what it looked like or what was happening around the perimeter.
Well, yeah, it was just, that's an open field. And so there was just tent after tent after tent as far as you could see towards the ocean. You couldn't go in. The military were keeping the public out. Only the need to be there people were there, and the people that needed to maybe find their family or something.
So, just to clarify, if you were driving down Marine Corps, you could see all this with the naked eye, just to be on the fence? Or?
Yes.
Could you describe that a little bit?
Well, at the time, Assen, if you look at it today, there's a perimeter road. And just on the inside of that road, I think there was at least 15 two-story barracks in there. And that was used during the Vietnam War for bringing soldiers back, and that's where they convalesced for a while. And then all of a sudden, this broke out, so they started using it that way. And then they had tents out in the fronts of that, and that's where people were brought out to work with, but they were putting them in the barracks. So anybody going by could see it, but they were restricting who gets in, so we had our Red Cross information on, so we could get in easily. Towards the end, I think the ship that went back, both of us dealt with some of those people. They had them all at Assen. We had about 1,500 people in the barracks. They had burned down at least one barracks. And every time I went in trying to locate people and help them find their families, the U.S. Marshals would tell me that if something happens, they're not going to come in and get me. But I felt I was the only one going in, and that's their only hope of finding maybe somebody who's still left in their family. So I never really felt that in danger, but they seemed to think there was a danger. Like we said before, most of the people that dealt directly with the Vietnamese, they knew what was going on, but the majority of the people in Guam just knew that they were here. They didn't really interact because they were kept in camps, and that was to protect the Vietnamese, not necessarily to protect the local people.
Later, the Ritters discussed the black market trade in gold between civilians on Guam and refugees in the camps.
In the Red Cross, we were told never to deal with any of the gold because there were supposedly people swindling the Vietnamese out of their gold because the Vietnamese had no idea what gold was worth here. And you hear all sorts of little stories about somebody getting a good sizable amount for something that wasn't worth what they got.
It's no longer around as much, but one thing that I thought came out of the Vietnamese coming through was the bot chains. They had all different kinds of pendants made from bot and the gold. And that lasted for many years, but like any fad, it's kind of I think it's lost its meaning because of the generations coming up that can't relate to it. But I think that came out of the refugees or the Vietnamese folks coming through.
Yeah, the gold they carried, the bot chains and that kind of stuff. I think people realize that if a country does fall, that's about the only thing you've got that could be value if you have to leave. And I think a lot of people started collecting more gold here after that than they ever did before, just because they saw what happened to these people.
Interesting. Okay, so you're saying it was almost like a lesson learned?
Yeah. What do you do when you flee a country? But if you have at least something in gold, it's valued all over the world. Where there's people that came out with supposedly suitcases full of cash, but South Vietnamese currency, and it was worthless.
You hear a lot of stories about people going to the perimeter of the gate at Assenburg, maybe some of the other more publicly accessible or publicly visible camps, and doing a lot of trading and currency exchange and buying gold. Is that anything that you guys ever personally witnessed, or do you remember hearing any stories at the time that come to mind that you might think would be interesting to share?
I was never really out at the near the fence or whatever, that area, and I just wasn't around that kind of stuff most of the time. We heard that this was going on, and our Red Cross directors kept saying, stay away from that because we can't have the Red Cross involved with something like that too. And it really isn't fair to the people that people are doing that. But yeah, it supposedly was happening, but I don't have any personal experience that way.
In our fourth episode, former Congressman L.J. Castro of Saipan discusses several key moments and debates from the Northern Mariana Islands self-determination process of the 1960s and 70s, including the Marianas Political Status Commission's negotiations with the United States government to end the NMI's status as a U.S.-administered trust territory. Through the so-called Covenant Agreement, the Northern Marianas were ultimately able to establish the islands as a commonwealth of the United States, with greater rights, autonomy, and citizenship. However, this result was not a foregone conclusion. In fact, for many years, there was incredible pressure for the islands that comprise the Northern Mariana Islands to federate with the Micronesian islands of Palau, Yap, Chuuk, Ponape, Koshrai, and the Marshall Islands. This proposed nation would have consisted of more than 2,000 islands, scattered over about 3 million square miles of the western Pacific Ocean. But many in the Northern Mariana Islands didn't want to join, and there were signs that the whole idea might crumble under further negotiations. One of the people we interviewed for episode 4 was Pedro Agulto Tenorio, who played key roles in these various negotiations. He would later be elected lieutenant governor of the NMI, and serve as the Commonwealth's last resident representative to the United States. Here's a part of Tenorio's interview that didn't make it into the episode, in which he explains to Castro that he had inside information that some of the other islands, which were expected to join a unified Micronesian nation, actually planned to back out and instead form their own republics. This made it easier for Tenorio to push for the Northern Mariana Islands bid to become a commonwealth of the United States instead.
At that time, let me backtrack and explain the reason why I was actually more convinced that joining the Micronesian Federation is futile, hopeless case. While I was in the Congress of Micronesia as a senator, through the process of legislative interactions with the other senators, I become good friends with the future president of the Marshall Republic of the Marshall, Amata Kabua. He was a senator from the Marshall Islands, and he happened to be a friend not only because we were together, but my brother Manny. Manny spent time in the Marshall, so he get to know Kabua very well. And then Kabua happened to be also some kind of distant relative with Manny's wife.
Tina.
Tina, yeah. So that's how the relationship with Amata Kabua became a little bit more closer because of not only because we're colleagues in the Senate of the Congress of Micronesia, but also a family friend, a family elder. And the other person that I befriended and had a good relationship was Roman Mutu from Palau, Senator Mutu. These two people, we used to talk about status, and I begin to learn from them that they're really over there just to kind of observe what the chairman of the Micronesian Status Commission Lazarus Ali was trying to, do in terms of forming a federation, which eventually became the Federated State of Micronesia. But at that time, the critical conversations that I've been having with Amata Kabu and Roman Mutu was this. He told me, Pete, the Marianas should get out of this talk, this status commission talk, and they should not consider joining the federation because Marshall is not going to join. We're going to be out of it, including Palau from Mutu. See, so my mind was kind of a little bit, not confused, but, I started thinking, I was still interested in seeing the end result of the negotiation. At the same time, I know that many people here, the Popular Party especially, they wanted me to change my mind and go for the direct negotiation like what we were doing. I became a critical person there because I was a senator, elected senator, and I been a very strong chairman, Ed. So when I started thinking about what's happening with the other districts, I figured, well, there's no point then in pursuing any further what two important, very influential leaders of their respective district, the Marshalls and Palau, were against the Micronesian political status initiative to keep Micronesia together. And so I, through that, and believe it or not, even the Territorial Party was pretty much endorsing the negotiation, the Marianas political status negotiation. So, at that time, then I figured, well, I'm going to have to go forward with this thing. Don't go any further as far as discussion with Micronesia because, we're not going to get anywhere. And the people here are people, both sides, territorial and popular, they want American U.S. citizenship. My parents, your grandparents, the leaders, the legislature, municipal council, they're all joining in.
The fifth episode of Memoirs Pasifika tells the story of Guam's campaign for marriage equality through interviews with several people who played a major role in the historic effort or who have contributed in some way to the movement for greater LGBTQ rights on Guam. One of the interviewees is Joshua Tenorio, the current Lieutenant Governor of Guam. He's the first openly gay person nationwide to be elected to that role. In this clip, Lieutenant Governor Tenorio speaks with Dr. Vivian Damas, who also anchored episode 2. They discuss an emotional coming out to his mother, and he shares memories of how his relative, BJ Cruz, who is also interviewed in episode 5, was publicly smeared for being homosexual after being nominated to serve as a Superior Court judge with Guam's family court.
What was it like for you coming of age as a gay Chamorro man in Guam in the mid-90s?
Well, I didn't come out in the mid-90s, so I was in the closet still back then. And I would say I'm in the generation right before I think people were coming out more, I guess. When I was out to friends, but to me, the most important person to come out to was my mom, right? My dad had passed away since 1994, so he wasn't around. But I came out to her, maybe about a little less than 20 years ago. And so I would say that, for a period of time, I was still in the closet. I had struggled with it because of the political nature of the work. Although growing up, I had seen a lot of bias against gays and a lot of bullying going on too. And it really wasn't until I worked for BJ, really working for him in the legislature, it showed to me that as long as you were very honest about it, people really didn't care, actually. It's when you were lying about it, that's when people were going to be mad. So I would say that those are kind of the lessons for me coming out. For my mom, I have to say that my mom cried, but her tears, she was more crying out of fear. She doesn't want anybody to hurt her son, and so she was scared about it. But, I kind of laughed, told her, she'd be fine. In fact, Vivian, she told me that she thought it was her fault because she took fertility pills to get pregnant. So I thought to myself, Mom, you're a teacher. You shouldn't be thinking like that. But, it just shows the kind of, what the different generations and how the issue of sexuality and being gay on a small island has kind of definitely evolved.
Yeah. What year were you born?
1973.
73. Okay. So you were still really young when BJ was nominated to the bench in 1985, and that was really the very first time that Guam sort of came out in a very public way in
Right.
opposition to a public official.
Sure.
And it was nasty. It was not a good experience.
It was very nasty.
But as you started to come of age, did you know about that story? Did you know about what happened to him?
I did. I mean, he's my relative, right? So just so you know, his mom is the older sister of my mom's dad. So, I mean, although I was younger, I was conscious of it. He became a judge. I remember watching the news and seeing the protests, and later on in life when I read the articles and saw some of the horrible things that people were saying at the public hearing, I was also at the same time real gratified that the legislature sidestepped that, and a vast majority of the legislature confirmed him, and he turned out to be the champion of children, the champion of families. He was in charge of family court, and he really turned that on its head, I think, because that was what they were arguing against. If you read the articles, he didn't have any ethics. He had a bad character because he was a homosexual, and therefore he was not competent to be on the bench, and he proved them for sure wrong. But that's also kind of embedded in the fears for people that were coming of age during that time. So I turned 18 in 1991, at the end of 1991, right, which is just 5-6 years after, you saw all of that ugliness peek its head. And of course, I went to school both in Catholic school and in public school. Right, and there were conversations about that at the time as well. So I mean, it was one of those things where I didn't want to disappoint my family and my friends. I felt it was going to be a disappointment for them if they found out that I was gay. In fact, for many years, I thought I'm not. I can only tell you that as an adult, and I look back at that time, it really does give me insight to what youth go through, especially trans youth. I can't imagine the things that happen for trans youth that are in households that are not supportive, right? And growing up, and you see younger people get alienated from their families, some of them homeless, because the families turn on them. Those were fears I had, and I was just grateful that my family wasn't like that.
Mm-hmm. Remember the Laddie magazine article when BJ Cruz, yes, were right on the cover. Tell me your reaction to it at that. You were a young adult then.
Yeah, I mean, I was amazed. I thought to myself, this guy has a lot of balls. He had certainly a lot of, a lot of courage, but he is the trailblazer for us, for sure, for all of us. And he was unapologetic, and he was very courageous. It showed people, and I grew to know that the more of us that come out, the more of us that come out to our family, to people at work, the more people can relate to having somebody who is LGBTQ in their social circle. It's normal. There's a lot of us out there. And I would say now in 2021, certainly it's a much better situation. I mean, we have gay clubs in the high schools. It's amazing. And in fact, at the first youth council meeting that the governor convened a few weeks ago for this school year, the members were very, very intent on having a subcommittee on diversity. They felt that was an important thing for youth to be focused in on. So I think it's just amazing. I mean, we didn't have that support system like that in schools when I was going to school. And not many people were out at all. It would hardly any. And if they were, they were ridiculed, and it was, sometimes living in fear.
Our final clip is from an interview conducted with Larry Regetol for episode 6, which is about the revival of traditional seafaring in the Mariana Islands. Regetol is a master navigator, canoe builder, and teacher. He was raised in Lamitrek, a coral atoll consisting of 3 Caroline Islands in the Federated States of Micronesia. As you might guess, there was very limited technology and communication with the outside world in those days on Lamitrek, so children passed much of their time learning to carve in the canoe houses while listening to the older men tell tales. So when Larry grew older and began exploring beyond his island, he was often astounded by what he found. Here he is, speaking with Dr. Michael Lujan Bavacqua and me.
And then there's all other kinds of activities. If you're not in the water, you're doing something else in the canoe house where the men are carving a canoe, or where the men are carving something else, working on a project. And you would find little boys my age at that time to be also hanging around and watching and listening to stories by the old men is like the best thing you could do in a canoe house. Of course, the payment for that is that you have to pull so many white hair off the old man's head. And in pulling those white hair off, you're hearing all kinds of stories, legends, all of which were like, I would equate it to watching a television set. And then, of course, you were also the slave of the men in the canoe house. So whenever they needed something from the house, they would tell you, "Hey, Larry, can you go back and bring this? Oh, Larry, can you take my coconut shell and wash it in the ocean?" Usually if you do those, you're rewarded with a story. So we actually can sometimes, little boys would fight over who would do those things, because you take pride over and you're looking forward to the reward of hearing a story. So I guess those little responsibilities given to you at that young age was to me the thing to do. And I would fight my little brother just to do that, because I needed to get that little fish hook that the old man might give out. And eventually you start to grow into it, and then you begin to pick up in adze and start carving the canoe and work alongside the men. So as you're growing, the responsibility is growing with you. But typically the lifestyle on Lamitrek would just be that. If it's not school, it's about working in the canoe house. It's not about working in the canoe house, it's about playing with your friends, going off to climb some coconut tree and tie a rope on it and start swinging out into the lagoon or something of that sort.
You said pulling the white hairs. Is that a phrase, or is that a literal thing they would have you do?
No, that is a literal thing that we do, because the older men figure, pulling white hair from the beard. So if I go back now, I'd be popular with the boys. But for some reason, that was a full-on task. It was to pull white hair of the elders, and they would like it because they fall asleep. But for me, I like it because I hear the stories. And there's some times when some elder might be working on something and some boys are just like, "We need to pull your white hair." And they're like, "No, we need to work on this project." But for younger boys, they're like dying just so they can pull some white hair to hear stories.
I like that. I'm going to tell my kids about that.
Yeah, it's a very good. I haven't had my own chance of being in the canoe house now and laying there and telling stories and having surrounded by young boys pulling white hair, but that was the thing. And when you found yourself to be around an older man and pull white hair, you'd be very lucky.
That is awesome.
But you could tell who in the community didn't tell good stories because no one would pull their white hair. That guy's boring.
No, absolutely.
He has a white hair,
Yeah.
white beard.
Yeah, and you know that too is like interesting. It's an activity that while it's for the kids, those older men who are also sitting and doing something, carving, they're also listening to that old man in the corner telling the story. And they too are participating in the activity just by hearing it. And occasionally they may pitch in like, oh, you forgot this part, you know. And so the old man will carry on if they remember that part. And the interesting part about those stories is that some of them, they don't seem to ever end. The story would go on for the whole afternoon and will continue tomorrow, and it will continue, and it's still the same story, but just keep going. And it seemed to be very engaging with the young boys in learning. Yeah, a lot of them are about stories of ancestors, and a lot of them are real legends about seafaring, the origin of seafaring. Those stories, once told, you would have all the kids come and sit around and start listening into the story, because it will be in the end, in some of those, a good number, I'd say maybe all of these stories, they would always have some very important lesson taught to the young boys, whatever that may be, or several lessons being taught.
So you said that you left Ireland for school, and so I know that you were telling me earlier about how sort of unreal it was when you came to Guam, for example. And so what was it like when you first got to Guam?
So the first time that I ever left my island to go abroad was back in the early 80s, and that was going to Chuk for high school. And actually, prior to going to Chuk, I went to Yap for the summer. And it was the first time, I believe it was 1981, when I first saw cars. And just riding a car in Yap at that time, because speed limit was 15 miles per hour. And even that was like quite an interesting experience of riding a car. In fact, prior to getting on the car, somebody had told me that when I go to Yap, I'm going to see some very big giant crabs, and these crabs are very different colors. So when I saw the car, I thought that was the crab. It's a blue crab and red crab, but Yap didn't have that many cars then. Then I went to Chuk. I finished up my high school 87. And so I, some reason, applied to go to university, and I was accepted to go to University of San Francisco in California. And I said, okay, I will go. So I found a way to get on the plane, which was the first time to fly from Yap to Guam. And I never forget that experience of, first of all, flying, which was an amazing thing. These were Continental Micronesia planes, 727 jets that were flying in those days. But I made it to Guam, and somebody picked me up, and the first thing that I remember was driving down on Marine Drive, and there were obviously more lanes and cars that were going. I thought I was going to die because the car was going to slam into something, because we were going at 35 miles per hour, and that was too fast, incredibly too fast for me. So Guam, my first recollection of my experience on Guam was being afraid of riding in a car at that fast, at that speed, and seeing a lot more cars than I've ever seen. And then, of course, at the terminal here in Guam, the old terminal, they had a it had one escalator that made me rode that, and it was pretty freaky to me. It had me freaked out for a moment just watching that escalator and not knowing how I was going to get on it, because I was afraid I might fall. But yes, those were good days of breaking into the new world. Yeah, interestingly, I remember one of the elders that was always a good storyteller was an old man from Lamatrek who went up to Tinian in those days, perhaps in the 60s, only because he had leprosy. And I think the colony was up in Tinian at that time. So he would have been considered the first Lamatrek men to have gotten on a plane. And I don't know what kind of plane he rode. But he would tell us stories in the canoe house about his experience. And one of the things that I'd never forget, and that story repeated itself even down the line, was that on his way to Tinian from Yap, that somewhere along the way, the pilot announced that they would take a break, and the plane parked on the clouds, and they got out, and they were able to eat sugar that they just get from within the clouds, because the clouds are made up of nothing but sugar. So when I heard that story, it stayed with me. So when I was like going to have my chance of flying, I'm like, okay, I want to see if there's really sugar coming flying on the wings of the aircraft. But obviously it wasn't true. But every boy that grew up on that island and heard that story, I'm sure that became something of an interest to them to go eat sugar in the clouds.
What a way to find out you've been tricked, huh?
Oh man. And the interesting part is to go back to it, and that old man continues to tell that story, and I just look at those poor boys and I'm like, yes, you will find out yourself.
That concludes our final episode for Season 1. I hope you enjoyed hearing a bit more from our past anchors and interviewees. We encourage you to go back and listen to any previous episode you may have missed to get a fuller picture of some of the topics and people discussed here today. Sadly, our grant funding has also come to an end, so this is likely to be the last episode we release for the foreseeable future. It's been a wild ride, and everyone here at Memoirs Pasifika has had a lot of fun producing this show. We learned a ton about the region's history, how to make a podcast from scratch, and about how many more great stories there are in Micronesia that are just waiting to be shared. We hope you, our loyal listeners, enjoyed the few stories we were able to share. Thanks so much for tuning in, leaving kind reviews, and sharing our content with family and friends. We truly do appreciate it. And finally, I would like to personally give a very special thanks to Ryan Shook, the podcast's audio engineer, and to the show's intern, Annie Faye Camacho. I couldn't have produced this show without the two of you. Okay, from everyone at Memoirs Pasifika, Sizuis Ma'asi and Azios.
Memoirs Pasifika is supported through grants from Humanities Guam, the Northern Marianas Humanities Council, the Guam Council on the Arts and Humanities, and the National Endowment for the Humanities.